Hey everybody, Dr. Staggering here again, bringing you another lecture on global warming, climate change. This lecture is going to pick up where we left off. We were working on predicting climate change and global warming and what sorts of things we can expect to happen. And basically where we left off was that these things are pretty tough to predict. You can try to use some physics and mathematics to do it, but it gets really, really complicated really fast. Once you begin considering feedback loops and how interconnected everything is on Earth in terms of its climate system. So that brings me to today's lecture, where we will focus on predicting climate change based off of paleoclimate data. And we talked some about paleoclimate data. That's the climate of Earth's past, and basically examining the climate at different periods of Earth's past to help us get a feel for where we might be headed. That'll be the idea. And we will be focusing on a concept called sea level rise, because that is one of the major impacts that global warming will have on the world. And yeah, let's get right into it. So like I was saying, the last lecture we were talking about these different climate models and predictions that were being forecasted based off of what sorts of things we do in terms of our pollution. And these are broadly based off of the concept of Earth's energy balance and this really complex idea of we have energy coming in from the sun, but that energy, some of it gets reflected, some of it gets absorbed, some of it turns into heat. Some of that heat is directed to do certain things. Some of that heat is back radiated to Earth with greenhouse gases, all this really complex stuff. And when you really start picking this apart, you realize that if you change one thing, the whole thing changes, and you could try to make predictions about what's going to happen using this kind of mathematics stuff, but those predictions might not be all that great. And it turns out that previous predictions about global warming that were made 10 or 20 years ago, we see that the things that are happening currently are happening much faster than anybody expected. And I think part of that issue is how interconnected all this stuff is. So that brings up a good point. Okay, if this isn't super useful for making predictions, what could we make predictions off of? And I just kind of want to remind you that we have all this data on previous greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and on various climate indicators of the world. And when you look at that data set, which goes back for carbon dioxide concentrations, it can go back here quite a long ways back, 800,000 years ago. We can see that we're kind of going off of the chart in terms of carbon dioxide concentrations, and the same is true with methane, these powerful greenhouse gases. So we can expect a decent amount of warming to be coming our way. And it's something to note also is that when we look at the modern trend, this is not a straight line that this carbon dioxide is going up in. It's actually accelerating over time. So you can kind of see it swooping up. So each year we grow more and more compared to the last year. So this trend is accelerating. So there doesn't appear to be any end in sight. We're just going to keep going up and up and up. We would anticipate that this warming that's going to follow due to the greenhouse effect will continue to go up and up and up as well. So what sorts of changes are likely to happen in the world, and just how hot do we expect it to get exactly based off of these trends? Again, you could take the mathematical approach to analyze all this kind of thing and try to make a prediction. What I would say is more effective is let's go look back at geology and look at the Earth's past and study what we can about Earth's climate in the past and ask ourselves, has there ever been a time in Earth's history where something similar has happened with an accumulation of greenhouse gases? And if so, what happened to the Earth during that time period? Did it get hotter? What other kind of changes did we see in terms of shifts in climate, rainfall, temperatures, etc.? And that is the approach that we will be taking today in the lecture. So You can analyze many different things to look at what climate and the temperature was like in Earth's past. We can look at rocks, we can look at ice cores, we can look at fossils. One really neat thing that scientists do are looking at stomata. These are fossilized stomata. What stomata are basically how plants breathe. So plants breathe in carbon dioxide and they breathe out oxygen. And these little stomata are on the leaves. They're microscopic little holes on the leaves that basically let the plants breathe in and out. What we find is that when plants have lots and lots of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, they don't need as many of these. And when there's less carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, then they need more stomata to breathe. You can kind of think of it like people that live at high elevation. You know, humans, you breathe in oxygen, and we have these things called red blood cells that carry the oxygen through our blood. When you go up to high elevations, there's less oxygen. And so therefore, people that live at high elevations need more red blood cells to carry, to make up for that less oxygen. Same kind of thing happens with plants. Plants breathe in carbon dioxide. If there's lots of carbon dioxide, you don't need as many red blood cells, stomata. And if there is very little carbon dioxide, like the equivalent would be people living at elevation, you need lots of stomata, just like people need lots of red blood cells. So we can actually look at fossils of plants and put them under a microscope and actually look at what the stomata look like. And we can even figure out how much carbon dioxide was in the past based off this principle. We can look at other things like fossil distributions, and I'll cover that one later. And isotope ratios, we talked a bunch about isotopes already, but we can look at those heavy and light isotope ratios to get an indicator of how much basically ice there was in the world at different times. So when we look at all that data, this is our reconstructed vision of Earth's past in terms of how warm it was. So the scale here on the left side is 0 is basically the temperature it was around 50 to 100 years ago. That's our 0 on this graph. So that's the temperature from 1960 to 1990 average. So that is our 0 on the graph. And we can see that during Earth's past, we've had times where we were below what it was, below 0, below our 0 average, when the Earth on average was colder than it was from 1960 to 1990. And then we can also see that above this, there's also plenty of times in the Earth's past where the temperature was warmer than it was from 1960 to 1990. Here at the bottom, we can see time. And one thing to kind of look at is that the scale of time changes. So from this section of the graph, from 0 to 20, that's going from 0 to 20,000 years in the past. So this is the pretty recent past, blown up here in the graph. And then we go from 20,000 years to 1,000 years, which is 1,000,000 years. So this is the 1,000,000 year mark. So we can see the changes here are kind of compacted compared to this other chunk of the graph. So we have a different scale here compared to this scale here. And then again, the scale changes again. We go from 1,000,000 back to about, 7-ish million or so here. And then we go from 7,000,000 back to the time of the dinosaurs around 65 million years ago. So over this 65 million year period, we can see that it started out pretty warm. Earth gradually became cooler and cooler and cooler. And then on average, around 3 million years ago, it crossed over to being cooler than it was from 1960 to 1990. And then around 1,000,000 years ago, we get this weird little pattern, this oscillation. And these are the ice age cycles. Really, really distinct ice age cycles over the last about 400,000 years of Earth's history. So the question is, what can we learn about this past? And the answer is we can learn a whole bunch. Currently, we are here. We are above what it was from 1960 to 1990 by about closing in on about a degree warmer than it was back then. And different projections can put us to worst case scenario increase by something like 5 to 8 degrees by the end of the century. Most bad models put us at going to around +5 by 2100. So we'd be somewhere in this region. And So no matter what, we're suggesting that we're going to start rising here. And the idea is that, okay, it's getting warmer here. We want to know what happened. Can we go back into Earth's past at these previous warm times? So what happened here? The Earth was a bit warmer than it is today during that time period. What was going on in the world? If we go back a bit further, there's something called the Eemian period. We have this ice age cycle, so that's something else we'll talk about. About 20,000 years ago, there was an ice age. How did the world change during that ice age? And then before that ice age, there was a warm period called the Eemian. We call that an interglacial period. So again, what was the Earth like then? If this is kind of where we're heading, is to get something like in this level of warmth, it would be very useful to know exactly what the world was like at that time period. We can go even further back where we had back to the Pliocene, which was 3 to 5 million years ago, where we saw that Earth was consistently warmer than even the Eemian period. And then if we go way back to around 50 to 60 million years ago, we get into that Paleocene, Eocene thermal maximum, and where the Earth was way warmer than it was today. So we can ask ourselves, okay, if we are heading on this trajectory of getting warmer and warmer, what sorts of things can we expect to see in the world? And we can also ask ourselves, what sorts of things cause the world to get warmer during these time periods? And will we begin seeing those as well today? So starting with this one, which we call the Holocene Climatic Optimum. This is basically the last, between around 5 and 10,000 years ago. The Earth was in a position around the sun where it was what we would consider a climatic optimum. In other words, nothing had changed too much about the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, but mainly what changed was that the Earth was just right in the perfect positioning around the sun to create kind of the maximum amount of warming possible for the Earth. We call that a climatic optimum. As a reminder from a couple lectures ago, we have these things called the Milankovitch cycles, where Earth is going around the sun, but the pattern of the orbit changes, the wobble of the Earth's axis changes, the tilt of the Earth changes. All these things change very slowly over time. And when certain things kind of line up in a certain way, you can get optimal conditions of sunlight where the Earth tends to get warmer. And then the opposite is true. When you get sort of the opposite of an optimum, you get a minimum of solar conditions. That is what triggers ice ages. So this is the last time we were at this really optimum moment. And so CO2 levels were pretty normal, but we had optimal solar warming. And generally it's accepted that Earth was a little bit warmer than it is today, maybe by half a degree or so, something like that. So easily we will make it to this amount of warming based off the current trends of global warming and climate change. So we're talking about pretty conservative changes. We've already gone up by about a degree in the last 50 years or so. So if we only go up another half a degree, we'll be around where it was during the Holocene climatic optimum. And during that time, we already, just that tiny little amount, just that little bit of nudge above where we are today, we saw massive changes in weather and climate patterns. One example is here, Africa would have looked completely different in terms of where rain had fallen. This is around 9,000 years ago in Africa, what we think the biomes would look like, and this is basically present day. And what we see is that actually the amount of rainfall penetrating into Africa from this warm ocean, moving this way, was substantially more. So just because this ocean was slightly warmer, remember that's going to drive evaporation, and some of that evaporation is going to follow the rain. And because it's warmer and hotter, there's a little bit of more energy behind that evaporation, that wind that's being created here, and that rain was able to penetrate further and further into Africa, to the point where places today where we see a desert, This is the largest desert in the world, the Sahara Desert. A huge chunk of that 9,000 years ago would have been forest or grassland. So the savanna, that's where we see all the elephants and wildebeests and lions and stuff running around. Today, all that stuff is pretty much confined to this part of Africa. But back 9,000 years ago, those lions and wildebeests would have been able to wander across a much larger area of Africa. And so would have the rainforest would have been larger as well. So just the slight cooling trend that we were on. So all we're talking about is here. This is where we're talking about this climatic optimum. And we were on a very, very slight cooling trend until the last 100 years. Just that tiny change made really massive differences to the African continent. Also, oceans back 9,000 years ago were between 1/2 foot and 4 feet higher. There is some variability to that estimate, but we definitely know that the oceans were higher than they currently are. And you might be asking yourself, how could the ocean, what do you mean the oceans were higher? How can an ocean be higher or lower? And that is why we're gonna focus some on describing sea level rise in this lecture. So yeah, this question of, wait, how can an ocean rise? So if we took all water on planet Earth and we categorized it as either being in the ocean or being in ice caps, in glaciers on the North Pole and the South Pole, being underground, so you can pump water from underground resources, those are called aquifers. We know there's lakes and rivers, there's water in the atmosphere as clouds, and then there's water in the biosphere, that's the water that's in your body. So you can see that the vast majority of water on Earth is in the ocean. Second most water is in glaciers and ice. Third most is in underwater, ground waters. So the big question is, how can the ocean rise? How could we get more water in the ocean? There's no more water coming onto Earth, so it's the water. If the ocean is rising, if the ocean, the amount of water in the ocean is getting bigger, it must be coming from one of these other sources. And that's exactly right. When the Earth gets hotter, generally what happens is glaciers and polar ice caps melt. And as this water melts, it's got nowhere else to end up but into the ocean. And so as this melts more and more, the ocean, the amount of water in the ocean gets higher and the oceans rise. That's what happens. It's actually a little bit more complicated than that. There are a couple other factors that contribute. But generally speaking, as the planet is warming, oceans tend to rise, and as it cools, oceans recede. And the three main factors are glacial melting, that's the one I just described. And you can imagine in this diagram, if we have an ice sheet, like these really massive ice sheets in Antarctica and Greenland, where it's many, many miles thick, as it gets warmer and these ice sheets begin to melt and get smaller and smaller, all of this water basically ends up into the ocean and the oceans rise up. That's pretty simple. Where it gets a little bit more complicated, there's also something called ocean thermal expansion. And this is the idea that as you warm up anything, and we learned about this last semester when we were talking about energy and heat, but as you warm up any substance on Earth, what's actually heat, remember, is that chaotic motion of particles. So as you add heat to something like water, this chaotic motion increases and these particles begin kind of running into each other more and more. And as they do that, they actually push outward from each other. Easy way to see this is if you fill up a balloon with air and then you heat up the balloon's going to expand. The same thing happens with water. So as you heat up water, it just tends to expand. When you're talking about heating up the ocean and expanding the ocean, from our perspective on land, what that looks like is the ocean is getting bigger or rising up into the land. And another really interesting thing is groundwater depletion. So groundwater contribution to sea level. This is something I didn't really know about until just doing some research. If you didn't know, there is pretty large amounts of water underground, pretty much everywhere in the world. What happens is rain basically falls. So you got a cloud up here and it's drizzling rain down onto the land. Some of that water goes into rivers and lakes. Some of it's used by plants, but some of it kind of makes its way down into the soil. And once it's down underneath the soil, nothing really is getting at it, and it becomes groundwater. Certain kinds of rocks are actually porous, so they have little cracks and holes in them, and so the water just kind of seeps into those rocks, and that's what we call an aquifer. And for the most part, once it gets down there, it's not really going anywhere. It's pretty much stuck down there. Slowly, very, very slowly over time, groundwater will actually move and will kind of move downhill, and will eventually make it to the ocean, but that's a very, very slow process. Humans, however, really, really like groundwater because it's really abundant underneath us. And so what humans do is basically we drill down into these rocks that hold the water and we pump the water out. And mainly what we use it for is farming. So if you've ever flown in an airplane, sometimes you're flying over something that kind of looks like a desert. And then you see all these like weird little green circles, and those are all individual farms. And at the center of that farm is a well that's basically drawing up water from underground and then is distributing it around to this farmed area. So you get this like green oasis in this desert. And I never really put it together before, but basically when you do this, some of the water will make its way back down into the ground, but a lot of the water will evaporate in the process of farming. And that evaporation will eventually form clouds, and it'll rain somewhere that'll feed a river, and some of the water that we're pumping out of the ground actually makes it back to the ocean. So to put it all together, we've already talked about how the glaciers are melting, and that's contributing more water to the ocean. But when we pump water out of the groundwater and put it on plants, some of it evaporates and it ends up in either the atmosphere, but again, some of it will make its way back to the ocean as well. So the amount of groundwater and the number of glaciers in the world are shrinking. And as they shrink, the ocean is expanding. And then also as the ocean heats up, it's going to be expanding as well. So this is the idea of sea level rise. Combination of these two things is causing the amount of water in the ocean to rise over time. So we can also ask ourselves, okay, we learned about these three factors that contribute to sea level rise: glaciers melting, ocean thermal expansion, and groundwater depletion. The top two are just a consequence of a warming planet. The bottom one is a consequence of human agriculture. So based off of just a tiny bit of warming, we could expect something like 1/2 foot to 4 feet of sea level rise. And it kind of begs the question, okay, that's how much more we can expect. Have we seen any of this sea level rise so far with just the tiny bit of warming that we've seen in the last 50 years? And the answer is yes. We have seen some sea level rise already. So this unit here is a tiny unit. This is millimeters. Millimeters are, as a reminder, these tiniest little on this ruler. So these little tiny guys over here are millimeters, and I'm not sure, the camera doesn't seem to want to focus. Let's get them really close. Yes, those little tiny marks are millimeters. So when we're talking about 10 millimeters, we're talking about a centimeter, which is 10 of those. So 1 centimeter is 10 of those millimeters. 100 millimeters would be 10 centimeters. 1,000 millimeters is a meter. 1,000 millimeters is a meter, which is a little over 3 feet. So that's just an idea of the changes that are going on here. And we'll come back to these rulers anytime we need to reference something. So what we've seen in the last 100+ years is a very gradual, slow increase in the ocean levels. Starting back in around 150 years ago, you can see we were at maybe negative 60, negative 70, something like that here on this scale. And yeah, currently in 2020, we're somewhere in this range here on this particular graph. But you can see that the change over the last 150 or so years, we went from around negative 60 to around positive, what, 180, I think, or so. And that's a change of, so something in the ballpark of 250 millimeters, which corresponds to 250 millimeters would be something like that much. So oceans over the last 150 years have risen about that much. That's a pretty slow change. I mean, 150 years is a pretty long time. And you do notice some changes along coastlines, and we'll talk about that later in the lecture. But you can see that that's not such a major change. Assuming that we're going to have oceans that rise as much as they were 9,000 years ago when the planet was a bit warmer, we would expect at least another ½ foot coming, and potentially up to 4 feet, which would put us over this. So that would be a lot. I am constantly kind of shocked by how much oceans have changed in the recent past of Earth's history, and we'll get a little bit more into that here shortly. And it seems very, very likely that oceans will be changing very rapidly in our future based off the amount of warming that's happening. One other thing I want to talk about before moving on from this concept of sea level rise, when we talk about that roughly 25 centimeters or so, not quite a foot, that has increased over the last 150 years, we can actually begin to break down. Scientists have studied and analyzed where most of this water has come from. And so we can see, this is the breakdown. This is kind of an odd graph, but it's pretty well detailed. About 45%, the biggest chunk, is thermal expansion. So that's just the ocean as it warms up gets bigger. These other chunks we begin to break down. Let's see, purple chunk, this is ice melting in Greenland. The dark blue greenish chunk here, this is the groundwater contribution. So this is what humans, we pump up groundwater and it makes its way to the ocean after we use it on our crops. And that is our contribution, our direct contribution to the ocean rise. It's only around 10 to 20%. Then when we begin looking at all these other colors, we see, okay, Antarctic ice, glaciers, 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 glaciers. So the rest of this is all ice as well. So the true breakdown is basically around 45% thermal expansion, around 40-ish% is ice melting, and around 15% is just this groundwater being pumped up from the for crops and then making its way to the ocean eventually. This trend will continue, but it may change slightly. When we look really where the vast majority of water is on planet Earth, that's not in the ocean, it is in Greenland and Antarctica, and the vast majority of that is in the Antarctic ice sheet. And so far, Greenland has melted pretty fast, is melting fast. And so far, even with our little bit of warming and the oceans rising, Antarctica has been melting relatively slow so far, even though that's where most of the ice is in the world. So that's actually a good thing. And if you see, Antarctica's contribution to oceans rising is pretty small. It's this slice right here, this light blue slice. The problem is that as things get hotter and hotter and hotter, we can expect more and more melting from Antarctica. And that might accelerate the overall trend of oceans rising quite a bit, because that is where the vast majority of frozen water is in the world. Let's get back to the predictions. And I know that was kind of a sidetrack to talk about sea level rise, but mainly when we talk about how climate shifted in the Earth's past, one of the easiest ways to talk about how it shifted is by sea level rise. When oceans rise or fall, they leave very distinct marks on the world, and geologists can find those marks very easily. So we might not know exactly how warm things got or what the climate was like where, but we do know how much oceans have risen and fallen in the past. And it's pretty remarkable when you start looking at that data. So 9,000 years ago, oceans were a bit higher and it was a bit warmer. And I think easily we will get to there coming up in future in the rest of the century. I think it's easy that we could see changes like that, because after all, what we're talking about is that just this little tiny bit of warming here is what caused those changes in the oceans and around Africa, and we are potentially on the path to exceed that by a lot, right? So let's go back a little bit further in time and let's visit what were the oceans like in this ice age and what was the overall climate of Earth like. This isn't really helpful to answer where we might be heading, but it is helpful to see the scale of changes that are possible on planet Earth. It's actually quite amazing the differences that happened in the world during this ice age. This is a video showing you how the planet has changed over the last 20,000 years or so. And you can see that 20,000 years ago, we were in this really cool period of Earth's history. Ice covered a huge chunk of the planet. And then in the last, from about 20,000 years ago to about 10,000 years ago, this ice melted and lots of changes happened around the Earth. What you kind of notice when you first watch this map is how much the ice changes and how much of, the continents were frozen. But when you start looking closely, remember, as this ice melts, it's adding more to the oceans and vice versa. All of this ice that's covering these continents used to be in the ocean. And so when you have all this ice on the continents, the oceans are actually lower than they are today. And I want you to, as we were watching this video, look at this little spot over here during the Ice Age. So back during the last Ice Age, you could actually walk from Vietnam to Australia. We didn't really talk about it, but as this ice sheet is melting, the oceans are rising. But if the ice sheet is doing the opposite and is growing, as things are getting colder and colder on Earth, this ice can only grow from water that's on Earth. It has to come from somewhere, and it comes from snow that basically came from the ocean. And so as the ice sheets grow in the world, and we get something like an ice age, we actually see that the oceans drop quite a bit. And just how much have the oceans changed since the last ice age? If we go back around just 20,000 years ago, so humans were around Earth. I mean, this was not that long ago, 20,000 years. Oceans were around 120 meters lower than they currently are. Remember, the meter is the big guy. So 120 of these, that corresponds to around 400 feet. So oceans would have been about 400 feet lower just 20,000 years ago. And from this period coming out of the Ice Age, where it was heading towards that climatic optimum, where the Earth was a little bit warmer than it is today, all of that ice melting caused a massive surge in ocean levels, and oceans actually rose around 400 feet in about 10,000 years. I never quite appreciated how big of a change this represented for the Earth. A while back, I taught how during the last ice age, around 20,000 years ago, Asians, basically northern and eastern Asians, crossed a land bridge slash ice bridge from modern day Russia to modern day Alaska. And that happened 20,000 years ago. And that's where Native Americans came from in the North and South American continents. And that before then, there were no humans there. And I always thought this was really cool, but I didn't realize that this was pretty common for other places in the world too. For example, if you go past 20,000 years ago, you don't find human fossils in Great Britain, the islands of Great Britain. And that just happens. I'm partially British. I think I'm around a quarter of my DNA traces back to the British Islands. If you go back 20,000 years ago, there were no humans in Britain. And humans actually crossed into Britain on a similar land and ice bridge compared to like what the Native Americans did over in Alaska. And this happened around 20,000 years ago. So 20,000 years ago, Europe and Britain weren't merged by a glacier, but because there were so many glaciers on Earth and oceans were so much lower, there was actually no water between England and Europe. And you could actually walk from France to modern day England just because the oceans were so much lower. And so in the last 20,000 years, everything about each continent has completely changed. And it really gives you an appreciation of the kind of scale of climate change that happens on Earth. Again, we could expect oceans would change drastically if we got a lot colder and we went to an ice age, but the opposite is true currently. Currently, things are getting hotter, ice is melting, and so the oceans are rising. And the question is, how much could oceans actually rise, and what kind of shifts could we really see to the planet? So let's head a little bit further in time. We visited what planet Earth was like during the Holocene climatic optimum. That was this little time period. We saw that Earth changed a lot during the Ice Age, but let's check out this Eemian period. This was the last time that, we have these Ice Age cycles. So before the Ice Age, if we go back another 80-ish thousand years, we were in a pretty warm period for Earth history, the Eemian. So what was Earth like during that period of time? So the Eemian was the last Pleistocene interglacial period. So that was the last warm period that we were in before the current warm period of Earth, before the last ice age, so around 115,000 years ago. What scientists can reconstruct is that the Earth was somewhere around 1 degree Celsius warmer than currently. And I think we'll probably easily make it to that within the next 100 years. I almost think that's a guarantee. Carbon dioxide was actually still pretty normal, maybe 300 to, I think the highest it might have gotten was like 320 or something during this period. So there was definitely a bit of a greenhouse effect going on, warming the planet. And also we were in one of those Milankovitch optimums going on. And just in that time period, it was a little bit warmer. And just that tiny little change in warmth, we believe oceans were around 20 to 30 feet higher than today. And most of that would have come from Antarctica actually melting, and a good chunk from Greenland. How do we know that? In some parts of the world, we find these. So this is a coral reef. It used to be, in the ocean. Coral reefs don't occur on land. So this must have been in the ocean at some point. And when we used the rocks and analyzed the isotopes, we could figure out that this coral reef is around 115,000 years old. The problem is that we see it about 20 feet out of the water right now. So the assumption is that 115,000 years ago, the water was 20 feet higher in order for this coral reef to exist. Otherwise, it would have been impossible for a coral reef to be here. And so all around the world, we can see these kinds of fossils and distributions. And that's why I was saying that some of this climate data can be reconstructed based off fossils. 20 to 30 feet higher is a lot. Having the oceans 20 to 30 feet higher would represent pretty much an end to all coastal cities on planet Earth and would be pretty devastating to human civilization. And we got there just from 1 degree warming. Just to kind of hammer in how big of a change that represents for a place like Florida, which is our lowest state in the United States. This is what Florida would have looked like 115,000 years ago, when the oceans were around 20 to 30 feet higher. This is what Florida would have looked like during the Ice Age, which was around 20,000 years ago. Remember, the oceans lower considerably in that period. And this is now. And so like I was saying, I mean, we're easily going to pass 1 degree Celsius warming, warmer than we are now. I think that's almost a given based off of our trajectory of global warming and pollution. So the answer is that I could totally see the world going back to a state like this. Luckily for humans, it takes a pretty long time for all that ice to melt. And so there might still be time to correct the errors of our ways. But potentially over the next few hundred years, if we don't do anything, I would expect these sorts of changes to be possible in the world. I mean, they've already happened in the past. So, okay. What if we go back even a little bit further, 3 to 5 million years ago? That is what we call the Pliocene. And just to give us a reference to our chart and our current warming trends, this is our Pliocene period. So we're talking about this nice warm stretch here from around 3 to 5 million years ago. This was, you might be kind of asking yourself, why was the Earth slowly cooling down from around 60 million years ago to about 1 million years ago before what became the kind of modern ice age cycle? And the answer is actually plate tectonics related. Antarctica and Greenland have slowly been drifting further. Antarctica has been drifting further south, and Greenland has been drifting further and further north. And as they drift further towards the North and South Pole, it begins the conditions for glaciers and ice to form becomes more and more favorable. And slowly over time, what we saw is that more and more ice was forming in Antarctica and Greenland over this 60 million year period. And as you get more and more ice forming and you get ice sheets forming, remember we talked about that concept of albedo, how ice that's white actually reflects sunlight off of Earth. And that kind of acts as like a white t-shirt effect, cooling Earth off. So basically what is happening is that over this 60 million year period, we were getting more and more ice. And Earth was turning more and more like a white t-shirt, and we were cooling off over that period of time. But before that white t-shirt had fully formed in the Pliocene, we were in this warmer period of time where we were potentially, this is also within the realm of where we could end up. And so let's see what Earth was like back then. CO2 concentrations, by the way, back then were comparable to what they are today. So currently today, we're at around 420. So the amount of warming and these sort of changes are certainly within the realm of possibility of happening to Earth. 2 to 3 degrees warmer than today. I think, again, that's easily, we could make it to there. And oceans overall during this period were around 80 feet higher than they were today. And so it's hard to kind of show you a map of what that would look like, but basically all of Florida would have been gone at that point. So this is the Pliocene 3 million years ago, around 35 meters higher. So that is this kind of bright green color that you see, the lime green. And so the modern United States, the coastline, if during this period of time, would have looked something like this. So the entirety of Florida would be pretty much underwater. There might be a few little islands here or there. So you can see that's some pretty massive changes. And during this time period, it was an extended period of warmth. And so there really wasn't much ice forming in the world. And so the ice sheets at the time were pretty minimal. And so that partially explains why the oceans were 80 feet higher. Those kinds of changes would happen. They're not going to happen anytime soon, but it kind of shows you that if we hold at 420 parts per million of carbon dioxide for an extended period of time, and we hold at 2 to 3 degrees Celsius warmer for an extended period of time, over several hundred years, yes, the oceans would rise the same amount. I mean, there's not too much different today compared to back then. I said I would come back to this slide as well. I never talked about this little diagram here, which shows basically the vegetation that is found in different layers of rock in Alaska's history. So as we go back further into time, and as the climate was changing, and basically at the 5 million year mark, that would be the Pliocene here, what we just talked about. And then going back to the Paleocene and the Eocene even further, back around 20 to 50 million years ago, what we can see is that the vegetation in Alaska at various places has changed a lot. So currently, in places that we find tundra is generally a region where it's so cold that plants can't really survive, not anything that's a shrub or a tree. Only the tiniest little grasses might be able to make it there. And we find that across a lot of Alaska today. If we go back to the Pliocene, what we see is very little tundra in that time period, and mostly what we see is spruce and pine and hemlock forest. Those are kind of modern day coniferous forests. We do see some of that stuff in Alaska today, but most of Alaska is this tundra. And so you can see that this warming completely changed Alaska's climate and actually the biomes that you find there. There was much less tundra in the world and much more forest at the time of this warming. And as we go back even further into the warmest period of Earth's history in the last 60 million years ago, which was the Paleocene and the Eocene, where we see lots and lots of warming, we actually see hardwoods in Alaskan fossils. Hardwoods are trees like oaks and maples and things like that. There are none of those in Alaska today. You only find hardwoods thousands and thousands and thousands of miles to the south of Alaska. And so it kind of gives you an idea of this world that we're heading to. If we're only going to hold at 2 to 3 degrees warming, that's going to vastly shift the climate, the biomes, everything about pretty much every region on the Earth. So where we used to see tundras, we'll see forests, maybe even hardwood forests eventually. Pretty incredible to think about. And that takes us to our warmest period of Earth's history, most recent history, the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, around 50 to 60 million years ago. And this is one I think I brought up a while back. So really, really warm period of time on Earth's planet and in Earth's history. And yes, not only would you see kind of hardwood forests in places like Alaska, that we actually find fossils of things like alligators and crocodiles up in Alaska. So it was such a warmer Earth that it was almost unrecognizable. How much did the oceans rise? Oceans were around 300 feet above what they are now. So most of Antarctica would have melted. And that's about how much water Antarctica holds if it was all added to the oceans. And yeah, I think on average for the entire planet, it was something around 5 to 8 degrees warmer than normal. And believe it or not, this is certainly possible. We could be heading there. The worst climate predictions have us going between 4 and 5 degrees by the end of the century. And then presumably it would continue from there. So this is certainly possible for Earth. Again, greenhouse gas concentrations were much higher back then. Currently, as a reminder, we're around 420 today, parts per million. But that number is going up. So if we continue to contribute fossil fuels, if permafrost starts melting and releasing more carbon dioxide and methane, those numbers are going to go up. So we could certainly find ourselves in this range. I actually think that's likely at this point. And back then, yes, it got considerably warmer, 5 to 8 degrees warmer. Here's our world map of what it looked like during the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum about 55 million years ago. It's kind of recognizable, but you can see that huge areas of the world would have been flooded at the time. So all this is to say that currently our trajectory of warming, where we can get to 3, 4, 5 degrees by the end of the century, puts us at a place where if it holds there, we're going to see some really massive changes to the world, in particular to the level of the ocean. And so 300 feet is a lot. And currently, if we're talking about how much have the oceans actually risen in the last 130 years, it's nowhere close to 300 feet. Luckily, it's actually under 1 foot. As a reminder, oceans in the last 150-ish years have risen by something like 25 centimeters, which is pretty close to a foot. A foot would be that. So not quite a foot. So when we're talking about these oceans rising potentially as the Earth is getting warmer and warmer, it is generally a pretty slow process. The thermal expansion part happens pretty fast, but the glaciers melting, that takes some time. There are some different negative feedback loops as glaciers begin melting. Anytime ice is melting, it has a cooling effect. So the more ice that melts, the cooler it gets around that ice. So that's good. That kind of helps slow the melting down. Also, when the ice melts into the ocean and then the ocean gets colder, and that also kind of helps insulate the ice from melting any further. If you can imagine Antarctica and the Greenland ice sheets, usually where they're melting is when they're coming in contact with the ocean water, in particular if it's warmer ocean water. The oceans are warming. But similar to that experiment we did a while back with the ice cubes melting in fresh and salt water, we saw that the ice cube that was melting in the salt water, which the oceans are, that fresh melt water of the ice cube, the cold water that's melting off the ice cube, kind of stays next to the ice cube and kind of insulates it from melting too fast. And so luckily for us, this melting is kind of slowed down by these negative feedback loops. So ice can only melt so fast, but the expectation is if we get up to 3, 4, 5 degrees above normal, and we hold it there for several hundred years, ice is just going to keep melting and melting and melting, potentially for thousands of years. And at some point, we could assume that the oceans would get to some state like they used to be, where they're hundreds of feet higher than today. Fairly rapid ice melt has happened in the past. So even when ice was melting really, really rapidly coming out of an ice age, I think that the fastest it tends to melt based off the data we can collect on rocks and whatnot, fossils and things, would be something like 1 meter or 2 per 100 years was sort of the fastest this ice would melt and the oceans would rise. So again, 1 or 2 of these per 100 years. So per year, you're talking, not that much. So when I say that, oceans could rise 300 feet, I'm not saying it's going to happen tomorrow. This is a pretty slow process, but it most likely will happen eventually over the next several centuries or thousands of years. Which brings me to the final point, is how much are oceans currently rising? What's the rate? We know in the last 150 years, it's changed by about this much, which is pretty rapid, but not that fast compared to what it could be. But what about now? Is it melting faster than it used to? Obviously, it's warming up more and more in the world. What's happening to the current trend of oceans? Let's check. So here is the snapshot of the last 30 years or so of oceans rising. This is from NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. So this is pretty accurate. Most of this is based off satellite data, so even more accurate than this previous graph. And what we can see is that it's increasing over time, but it's actually accelerating the current amount of sea level rise. Our current rate is around 4 millimeters per year, which translate, if we stay at this current rate, it will be about 40 centimeters over a 100-year period, which is a bit more than a foot and a half or so. But what you can see is that this kind of swooping up, this acceleration, so it's not just a straight line. If it was going in a straight line, it would have gone like this. So we can see that it's swooping up like this. So it's accelerating. And we can try to predict how fast it's gonna, if it keeps on the current trajectory that it's on, how much sea level rise will we see in 30 years or another 30 years or by the end of the century, 2100. And we expect in another 30 years that the rate of sea level rise will be double. So from 4 millimeters per year, 4 millimeters is not a ton. It's 4 millimeters, that's about what it's going per year now. It's this tiny little sliver. But in 30 years, it'll be double that. So every year the oceans will be rising by that much. And that's getting pretty extreme. What that translates to is that over the last 30 years, we've seen the oceans rise about this much, but in the next 30 years, we'll see that double. So we'll be about that much. So over the next 30 years, we'll see likely oceans rising potentially as much as they've risen in the last 150 years, but in a 30-year period. And that is really a problem with climate change, is when things start accelerating, I don't think humans really grasp the idea of acceleration very well and of exponential growth. Actually, it reminds me of a quote from a physicist that basically says, the greatest shortcoming of the human race is our inability to understand the exponential function. We understand change over time, things changing over time, but we don't really understand the idea of acceleration, that all of the changes that we've seen in the last 150 years could happen in the next 30 years. And you go, okay, that sounds bad. And then you go, okay, what's it going to look like in another 30 years? It's like, okay, then we're going to see even more and more changes happening. And that gets pretty scary pretty fast. So if the current trend holds, by the end of the century, we'll be looking at something like 70 centimeters of ocean rise since 2000. 70 centimeters is substantial, about that much. And again, you might be thinking, okay, big whoop, what's the big deal with potentially, 17 centimeters over the next 30 years or 70 centimeters over by 2100? I mean, that doesn't sound so bad. It's pretty slow. Well, currently, the pretty small rate of change in the oceans right now, something like 4 millimeters per year, it just doesn't seem like much, is causing substantial problems for many, many coastal communities around the world. Coastal erosion is a problem just for about every single place near the ocean currently. And the idea is that as the ocean rises, the waves just kind of hit further and further in and begin eroding houses and ecosystems and the beaches and everything else. And over time, as the oceans rise, they just keep coming further and further and further into the land. A huge chunk of the world's population lives against the ocean because you have this lovely resource for travel, for food, trade, all that stuff. So as the oceans are changing, that's going to be problematic. Just for some perspective here, the state of Louisiana in the last 100-ish years or so has already lost about 2,000 square miles of land. So you can see the red area here would have been what Louisiana looked like around 100 years ago. And most of that red area is now open water because the ocean has creeped its way into it. So already the United States has lost land that's roughly the size of Rhode Island. And that happened over the last 100 years. But remember, over the next 30 years, we'll see about that much additional change. And then 30 years after that, we'll see even more change. That's the current trend. So that kind of brings us to the end of the lecture today. When we're trying to see where exactly we're going as humans with this global warming, this climate change thing. Why do I have these on? It is tough to know exactly, but we can imagine by the end of the century, we will have a substantial amount of warming, and the changes that are going to happen to Earth are not trivial. If that warming persists and it holds at that level of warming 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 degrees above where it is now, changes will begin happening that will continue happening for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And at its most extreme, the Earth could revert to states that are unthinkable. Oceans rising 300 feet. I think most humans, as you're growing up, you're learning, you're like, that's what the map of the world looks like. That's the world. And it's kind of this static thing. That's where a desert is. This is where the tundra is. This is where a forest is. That's the rainforest. But potentially all of that stuff is subject to change. Where the coasts are, the edges of the continents, where each ecosystem type is, where each biome is, all of that is subject to change. It has changed lots. Even in the last 20,000 years, it's completely changed. As we continue warming the planet more and more and more, we will see the same changes happening. And exactly how fast they're going to happen is hard to predict, but it's easily going to cause a lot of trouble for humans trying to live currently. So we'll leave this one at that, and the next one we'll talk a little bit more about these changes that we can begin seeing. In particular, how patterns of wind blowing are going to change, how storms are going to change, how oceans are going to change, and what sorts of things have already happened and what will happen in the future, more than likely. So that'll be it for now. Cool. See ya.